Part 4. Why War is Not Inevitable. 12 Clues for Peace. That war is an evil is a proposition so familiar to everyone that it would be tedious to develop it. No one is forced to engage in it by ignorance or kept out of it by fear. If both should happen to have chosen the wrong moment for acting, advice to make peace would not be unserviceable. This, if we did but see it, is just what we stand most in need of at the present juncture. Thucydides, Hermocrates addresses the Sicilians, 424 BCE. Fortunately, escaping Thucydides' trap is not just a matter of theory. The past 500 years offer at least 4 cases in which rising and ruling powers successfully steered their ships of state through treacherous shoals without war. The first of these cases occurred in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, when Spain rose to rival and eventually replace Portugal as the world's dominant sea power. The most recent is the rise of Germany to predominance in Europe since the end of the Cold War. The two most instructive cases of these good news stories come from the 20th century, the first when the United States deposed the United Kingdom as the leading global power, the second when an ascending Soviet Union threatened America's position as the unipolar power. Together, they offer a rich set of clues for leaders seeking to make the rise of China a fifth case of no war. Spain vs. Portugal. Late 15th century. For most of the 15th century, Portugal's fleet ruled ocean trade routes, overshadowing its Iberian rival and neighbor, the Spanish Kingdom of Castile. Portugal's success reflected its historical development. In 1249, its people became the first Europeans to escape Muslim rule, creating a nation largely along Portugal's modern-day borders. Then, in 1348, the Black Death killed 1/3 of the country's population, leaving too few able-bodied workers to farm the rocky soil. Enterprising Portuguese turned to the Atlantic and in time became Europe's most skilled and successful fishermen. The country's maritime prowess grew further after 1415, when the Portuguese captured their first overseas territory, near the Strait of Gibraltar. Determined to enrich his country and crown, the great Prince Henry the Navigator supported the development of new seafaring technologies, including the fast and nimble caravel, improved rigging for boats, and detailed maps. Pioneering the field of nautical science to great effect, Portugal essentially launched the movement of European expansion. In 1488, its explorers were the first Europeans to round the Cape of Good Hope in search of trade routes to India and its lucrative spice trade. During most of the 15th century, Portugal had a free hand to establish its predominance, because the Kingdom of Castile was preoccupied by internal conflicts. But that changed in 1469 with the marriage of the 18-year-old Isabella of Castile to the 17-year-old Ferdinand of Aragon, merging the two kingdoms into a unified Spain. Together they reclaimed territory from Moorish occupiers, recaptured Granada, and, in 1492, the same year, they sponsored the first voyage of a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, expelled the Moors completely from the Iberian Peninsula. As its internal affairs normalized, Spain's economy began to grow. Revenues to the crown rose thirtyfold between 1474 and 1504. Enriched, a rising Spain was emboldened to seek gold, spices, and new trade relationships across the sea, just as its neighbor Portugal had been doing for nearly a century. Spain's timing was fortuitous. With the death of Henry the Navigator in 1460, Portuguese patronage of innovation declined, as did its strict prohibition on exporting its shipbuilding and mapmaking expertise. By the 1480s, other nations had begun to exploit these skills and match Portugal's mastery of the Atlantic. When Christopher Columbus approached Henry's successor, King John Roman II, for funds to sail west in search of a new route to India and royalties for lands discovered, King John said no. So Columbus turned to Ferdinand and Isabella, requesting 3 ships, the titles of Admiral of the Ocean and Viceroy of the lands he might discover, and 1/10 of colonial revenue. The Spanish king and queen agreed. When Columbus returned triumphant, King John saw he had made a big mistake. Thanks to Columbus's discovery, Spain emerged as a serious rival for overseas empire and sea routes, threatening Portugal's virtual monopoly. Each nation worried about the potential for conflict, especially in new lands, as the leaders of both feared the enormous expenditure of blood and treasure an all-out war between these two military powerhouses would require. Fortunately for both, Ferdinand and Isabella decided to appeal to a higher authority, the representative of God on earth, Pope Alexander VI. As it happened, the Pope was of Spanish descent and had recently been elected with the support of Spain. Acting as arbitrator, Alexander VI drew a line from north to south running from pole to pole, dividing the Western Hemisphere. Lands west of the boundary would belong to Spain, territory east to Portugal. Judging this arrangement unfairly favorable to Spain, Portugal at first rejected the Pope's proposal. Nevertheless, it became the basis for negotiations leading to the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was signed in 1494. The agreed line cut through modern-day Brazil and explains why Brazilians speak Portuguese while most of the rest of South America speaks Spanish. Rulers in both capitals proclaimed it a triumph. Spain legitimized its stake in the venture of exploration. Portugal confirmed its claim to what it believed was the preferred route to India. As historian A.R. Disney notes, Tordesillas became a basic charter of empire, defining respective spheres of conquest well into the 18th century. The papal role in defining these spheres of influence created incentives to honor the treaty's terms. Each country's rulers were subject to papal authority, up to and including excommunication. Both nations justified their conquests as a mission to convert the heathen to Christianity. Indeed, when new colonial aspirants in England, France, and the Netherlands emerged over subsequent decades, Spain and Portugal embraced the Vatican-approved framework as guardians of the status quo even more tightly. Thus, there were no significant hostilities between the two countries for almost a century. Clue 1. Higher authorities can help resolve rivalry without war. Ever since the Dutch legal scholar Hugo Grotius coined the idea of a single, global society of nation-states in the 17th century, theorists have dreamed of a world governed by international law. In the aftermath of World War II, statesmen wrestled with this aspiration in creating the United Nations. Its charter established a framework of international law and organizations overseen by a Security Council to which members are, in theory, subordinate. Tellingly, however, the five great powers of the time, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, Britain, and France, each insisted on retaining a unilateral veto power over decisions by the Council. The UN Charter calls on each member state to accept constraints on its behavior, including its use of military force against other members. The interpretation of these constraints, however, is left to the members. Article 51 of the Charter gives each state the right of self-defense. The U.S. stretched this right to new limits in 2003 when it argued that its attack on Iraq was justified by preemptive self-defense, claiming that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and posed an imminent threat. More recently, President Obama pushed even further in unilaterally ordering attacks on groups the U.S. designated as terrorists in 7 countries. In the narrative offered by proponents of international law, the past 7 decades have seen a steady advance in the acceptance of the international rules-based system. Realists disagree, especially when it comes to the use of military force. There, they note that strong states have repeatedly flouted that system when they judge it in their national interest to do so. In 2016, for example, the U.S. led the campaign to condemn China's wholesale rejection of the Permanent Court of Arbitration's finding that struck down Beijing's claims to the South China Sea. Some observers saw this as hypocrisy, recalling that Washington had similarly rejected the International Court of Justice's judgment against it when the CIA mined harbors in Nicaragua in the 1980s in an effort to overthrow that nation's Sandinistic government. Clearly, at this point, subordination to international authorities has substantial limits. Nevertheless, to the extent that states can be persuaded to defer to the constraints and decisions of supranational authorities or legal frameworks, as the rulers of Spain and Portugal did in the 15th century, these factors can play significant roles in managing conflicts that would otherwise end in war. Germany vs. Britain and France. 1990s President Henry Kissinger has pointed to an ironic twist of fate. 70 years after having defeated German claims to dominating Europe, the victors are now pleading, largely for economic reasons, with Germany to lead Europe. In 1989, after the Berlin Wall's collapse, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher urged President George H.W. Bush to block the rush to reunification, warning that the Germans will get in peace what Hitler could not get in war. In fact, although the actions of a more powerful, united Germany have sometimes caused resentment, Germany's ascent to predominance in Europe has occurred not just without war, but also in a context in which military conflict with its European neighbors has become virtually inconceivable. The reasons for these developments are suggestive. World War II ended with Soviet troops occupying the eastern part of Germany, while US-led troops held the west. This division constituted for many European strategists the solution to the German problem that had been at the root of 2 20th-century world wars. When the Iron Curtain descended across the continent, as Churchill put it, the competition between the Soviet Union and the free world became Europe's primary fault line. In response, the U.S. organized the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In the oft-repeated quip of NATO First Secretary General its mission was to keep the Soviets out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Determined not to repeat the patterns of international politics that had made Europe a killing field for so much of the 20th century, wise European leaders like Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman fostered thick economic interdependence among the nations of Europe, and especially between France and Germany. This trade network soon grew into the European common market in which goods traded freely without tariffs. This became the first building block in a larger and more ambitious European project aimed at subordinating elements of national sovereignty to supranational European institutions. In the treaty establishing the European Coal and Steel Community, one of the key precursors to the EU, Monnet described an institution that would lay the first concrete foundations of the European Federation, which is indispensable for the maintenance of peace. Some of the visionary statesmen who orchestrated this effort even imagined a united Europe analogous to the United States. Yet everyone, including the Germans themselves, seemed to agree that Germany would remain a junior partner. Having internalized the Holocaust and other crimes against humanity committed by the Nazi regime, Germans distrusted themselves and readily accepted a subordinate role in European institutions. But in the final chapter of the Cold War, when the Berlin Wall crumbled, the prospect of Germany's reunification arose. West Germany's European partners in particular were dead set against it. Prime Minister Thatcher and President François Mitterrand went repeatedly to President George H.W. Bush urging him to prevent unification. As the French ambassador to Germany argued publicly, unification would give birth to a Europe dominated by Germany, which no one in the East or the West wants. Nonetheless, President Bush and his national security team moved ahead. They insisted, however, that a unified Germany remain inside NATO, not leaving it disarmed or neutral, as the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev sought. For Bush, a unified Germany leading European institutions would become a centerpiece in his vision of a Europe whole and free. As Thatcher and Mitterrand foresaw, Germany's growing economic strength increasingly gave it the dominant political voice on the continent. In 1989, German GDP was roughly equal to that of Britain and France. Today, it is 40% larger. 18 when the EC European Community became the EU European Union, and most of its members surrendered their national currencies to create a common euro, the European Central Bank was naturally located in Germany. Nonetheless, even as Germany's prominence increased, it held fast to a strategy of integration with its neighbors. As the noted German scholar Helge Haftendorn has argued, the EU allowed German power to be channeled toward a greater good, and created a Europeanized Germany rather than a German Europe. As of this writing, the European experiment remains uncertain. When the global financial crisis stressed the contradictions baked into the euro, namely, a common monetary policy without common fiscal authority, and forced Germans to bail out Greece and others, many predicted the end of the common European currency. Yet the euro remains alive. As Europe has been flooded by refugees from countries convulsed by post-Arab Spring chaos, Eurosceptics have again brought out their placards proclaiming that end is near. The June 2016 Brexit vote for the UK to leave the EU was for many the final sign of the post-Cold War order's imminent collapse. But as the architects of the European project understood, while crises that threaten the survival of the Union are inevitable, collapse is not. Indeed, from their perspective, crises present opportunities to strengthen integration in ways that political resistance would otherwise make impossible. Though an economic powerhouse and increasingly active political leader, Germany has remained a military eunuch. In 1945, it was forcibly disarmed and demilitarized as part of denazification. The U.S. security guarantee, and in particular the U.S. nuclear umbrella that remained after reunification, reassured Germany's neighbors by removing any reason for Germany to increase its military. Over time, Germany's leaders have rationalized this situation by embracing a postmodern conception of international order that sees security as essentially a natural state of affairs. Along with most of its European counterparts, Germany's military today is thus more symbolic and ceremonial than operational. In that sense, a militarily neutered Germany is not a normal state in international politics. Clue 2. States can be embedded in larger economic, political, and security institutions that constrain historically normal behaviors. Germany is the poster child of an economic and political giant that remains a military dwarf. It is economically integrated with its neighbors and protected by an American security overlord with a nuclear umbrella. If a combination of economic stress, immigrants, and a revival of populist nationalism were to unravel the EU, would an increasingly powerful Germany still pose no threat to its neighbors? If the US were to weaken or even withdraw NATO's security blanket, Would we see a renationalization of the military forces of Europe, including in Germany? And if that were to occur, could Thucydidean dynamics make war between Germany and some of its neighbors again thinkable? Or, alternatively, have the cultural changes in Germany become so deeply internalized that it is no longer imaginable that Germans recover their martial traditions? United States vs. Britain. Early 20th century Teddy Roosevelt's success in guiding the U.S. to displace Britain as dominant in the Western Hemisphere reflected changes in the underlying correlates of power. In the last 3 decades of the 19th century, the United States had risen from the ashes of its civil war to become an economic colossus. In 1850, the populations of Britain and America were roughly equal. By 1900, there were twice as many Americans as Britons. The American economy surpassed Britain's in 1870 and grew to twice its size by 1914. In 1880, Britain had accounted for 23% of global manufacturing output. By 1914, its market share had fallen to 13% as America's rose to 32%. Anglo-American relations remained tense after their acrimonious separation. In the War of 1812, the British burned the White House while Americans assaulted British Canada. During the Civil War, Britain had seriously considered supporting the Confederacy, a fact that many Americans, including TR, had not forgotten. As American power grew, so did its demand for respect and influence in its domain. In 1895, when a territorial dispute arose between Venezuela and British Guiana, Secretary of State Richard Olney demanded that Britain accept arbitration under the Monroe Doctrine, arguing that the United States is practically sovereign on this continent. London rejected Washington's demands, with British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain insisting that Great Britain is an American power with a territorial area greater than the United States themselves. But when President Grover Cleveland responded with a thinly veiled threat of war, the British agreed to arbitration. Not long after Cleveland's message, British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury advised his finance minister that war with the U.S. in the not-distant future has become something more than a possibility. He instructed the Admiralty to review its budgets accordingly, warning that the U.S. was a more likely adversary than the Franco-Russian alliance. While the U.S. Navy was still small compared to the Royal Navy, it was growing, especially after the Spanish-American War and Teddy Roosevelt's ascendance to the presidency. The First Lord of the Admiralty, the Earl of Selborne, described the situation starkly. If the Americans choose to pay for what they can easily afford, they can gradually build up a navy, fully as large and then larger than ours. Facing multiple rising challengers and bogged down in a troublesome South African war, Britain could no longer confront all threats head-on. Although the U.S. was the most powerful of its rising rivals, Germany and Russia posed a more proximate danger. Moreover, unlike Europe, where Britain could serve as a balancer among competing powers, the Western Hemisphere had no competitors to the U.S. that London could enlist as British allies. Britain's Canadian Dominion, for its part, had no capability to defend itself. These hard truths shaped British leaders' mindset of accommodation aimed at avoiding military conflict with the U.S. at virtually any cost. The Admiralty was at this time the cockpit of British national security policy. In 1904, its highest-ranking naval officer, First Sea Lord Jackie Fisher, bluntly told his civilian superiors that Britain should use all possible means to avoid such a war, because, he warned, under no conceivable circumstances could we escape an overwhelming and humiliating defeat by the United States. Further, he spelled out the humiliating implication, leaving Canada to her fate no matter what the cause of quarrel or merits of the case. As Selborne had summarized, "I would never quarrel with the United States if I could possibly avoid it." Reflecting that judgment, Britain exempted the U.S. from the canonical two-power standard, which committed the UK to maintaining a number of battleships equal to those of the next 2 largest competitors combined. Moreover, aware that it could not contest American dominance in the Western Hemisphere without reducing naval forces protecting more important areas including the homeland itself, the British Admiralty ignored repeated Army requests for operational plans to defend Canada in the case of war with America. Instead, it simply recommended that good Anglo-American relations be maintained. 3-4 Britain's recognition of this uncomfortable reality drove successive concessions over disputes in the Western Hemisphere. As a result, historian Anne Ord concluded by the end of 1903, Britain had acquiesced in American supremacy in the Western Hemisphere from Venezuela to Alaska. In part, British willingness to yield to American demands reflected the belief that both states shared not just an ethnic and linguistic heritage, but also a common political culture and model of governance. but the principal driver was cold realism. Facing more ominous threats closer to home, Britain's choices were constrained. Had Russia and then Germany not appeared such potent threats in this period, would Britain have played a tougher hand? That is unclear. But what is clear is that at this point the relative balance of power had shifted so far that British officials could not see war as a viable means to constrain America's rise. As Prime Minister Lord Salisbury wistfully reflected in 1902, "It is very sad, but I am afraid America is bound to forge ahead and nothing can restore the equality between us. If we had interfered in the Confederate Wars, it was then possible for us to reduce the power of the United States to manageable proportions. But two such chances are not given to a nation in the course of its career." In comparing British responses to two rising powers, the Germans to the east and the Americans to the west, the greatest 20th-century international historian, Ernest May, identified Britain's choice of forbearance toward the United States as the key to what happened, along with Germany's choice to put display of independence and of military and naval power ahead of all else. While President Roosevelt could be bellicose over minor disputes, he was, in May's words, careful to avoid the Kaiser's mistake of threatening Britain's actual security. Britain could convince itself that the U.S. Navy might serve British interests in the Western Hemisphere or East Asia. This judgment was encouraged by the vast Atlantic Ocean separating the two countries, which diminished America's direct security threat to Britain. Germany was much closer, and its navy was clearly intended to deter or fight Britain. Facing a challenging strategic horizon, Britain chose, as May pointed out, to make a virtue of necessity and to yield to the Americans in every dispute with as much good grace as was permitted. By 1906, when a new Liberal government came to power, Foreign Secretary Edward Grey announced that maintaining good relations with the U.S. had become Britain's cardinal policy. British leaders' skill in finding ways to satisfy even unreasonable American demands without sacrificing vital British national interests is a textbook example of well-executed diplomacy. By laying the foundation for what historians have called the Great Rapprochement, Britain helped to heal long-standing hostility between the two nations to the point that when war came in 1914, it could count on the U.S. as an essential source of material and finance for its war effort. After German submarines began attacking American ships, Washington joined the war alongside London. Had Britain been unable to obtain American loans and supplies, and later American military partnership, Germany might well have triumphed in World War I. In negotiating the peace at Versailles, the U.S. and Britain stood shoulder to shoulder. And when, after the war, the United States established the Washington Naval Treaty setting national limits on the number of capital warships each nation would be allowed, Britain was rewarded with a position of parity with the U.S., even though its post-war debts meant it could not compete with an American naval buildup. When less than a generation later the world was again consumed by war, the two nations fought as intimate allies and worked together after World War II to shape the peace, cementing what Washington and London still call the special relationship. Clue 3. Wily statesmen make a virtue of necessity and distinguish needs and wants. Brute facts are hard to ignore. As the U.S. surpassed Britain in all important dimensions, Americans' determination to have their way became evident. From the disputes in Venezuela to the contest with Canada over the fat tail of Alaska, Britain could have chosen or chanced war. But it knew that the cost of war would be large and the likelihood of victory small. It also faced other, more serious strategic threats closer to home. So Britain wisely made the best of its lot, managing to accommodate American demands without sacrificing its own vital interests. And it did so in ways that impressed upon America's governing class the interests the U.S. and U.K. shared, while minimizing interests that divided them, thus paving the way for greater cooperation and greater benefits for London in the future. At a time when its global empire was so firmly linked to its sense of self, Britain could have easily, but mistakenly judged its security stake in the Americas to be essential. But it was not. Far from diminishing its global stature or jeopardizing its security posture, Britain's shift of its fleet from the Western Hemisphere proved a timely rebalancing of its own forces before World War I and prolonged its influence in international affairs. Clue 4. Timing is crucial. Windows of opportunity open, often unexpectedly, only to close without warning. Prime Minister Lord Salisbury's candid observation captures this poignantly. If British leaders had concluded in 1861 that a rising U.S. continental hegemon would pose an intolerable threat to core British interests, then the smart option might have been to intervene on behalf of the Confederacy in the American Civil War and reduce U.S. power to manageable proportions. Had Britain done so, it is possible that it The beginning of the 20th century there would have been two weaker, likely rival and perhaps even warring nations on the territories of the United States. Under those conditions, with command of the sea and a secure position in Canada, Britain would likely have found two Americas far less demanding in territorial disputes in Venezuela, Alaska, and elsewhere. But in the history of nations, as in the life of individuals, opportunities missed are opportunities foregone. Preventive intervention presents a classic conundrum for individuals that becomes exponentially more vexing in the case of democratic nations. When the cost of intervention is lowest and the effectiveness of action highest, the need to act is ambiguous and uncertain. By the time the necessity for action is obvious to all the players whose support or acquiescence is required, the cost of effective intervention has risen, sometimes to levels that make it prohibitive. For governments, especially democratic governments in which many parties have to agree before action can be taken, this conundrum tilts the scales markedly toward procrastination rather than prevention, whether in dealing with rising rivals or recurring humanitarian catastrophes. Clue 5. Cultural commonalities can help prevent conflict. Because Britain and the U.S. shared a language and political culture, influential Britons could console themselves with the thought that although Britain was by most measures no longer number one, its values would remain dominant. They could dismiss those who argued that Britain faced a choice between conflict with the U.S. and the elimination of their way of life and historic mission. Quite the opposite. Many Englishmen embraced the thought that the English-speaking peoples would continue to rule the world. As future Prime Minister Harold Macmillan put it during World War II, these Americans represent the new Roman Empire, and we Britons, like the Greeks of old, must teach them how to make it go. Soviet Union vs. United States. 1940s-1980s. The idea that the Soviet Union seriously challenged American global leadership in the post-World War II period is hard for most Americans today to conceive. Since the collapse of the USSR in 1991, Americans have seen Russia as a declining power, weak, confused, and more recently, under Vladimir Putin, blinded by anger. Communism as an ideology that people could voluntarily embrace has been consigned to the dustbin of history. Command and control economics and politics have repeatedly shown that they do not work. Students at Harvard are thus confounded when I make them read a chapter from the most popular economics textbook of the mid-20th century, Paul Samuelson's Economics, an introductory analysis, published in 1964. It foresaw Soviet GNP overtaking that of the US by the mid-1980s. The 20th century was defined by a cascade of world wars, the first, the second, and the specter of a third that could well have been the last. In that final contest, the adversaries believed the stakes were so high that each was prepared to risk the death of hundreds of millions of its own citizens to defeat the other. After a struggle of 4 decades, in 1989, the Berlin Wall came tumbling down, in 1990, the Warsaw Pact collapsed, and on Christmas Day 1991, the evil empire imploded. The Cold War thus ended. With a whimper rather than the final bang leaders on both sides rightly feared. This stands as a rare U.S. victory in the years since World War II. How did the Cold War go so right when so many of America's hot wars since 1945 have gone so wrong? What insights can statesmen glean from that ordeal for today? The term Cold War was coined by none other than George Orwell of 1984 fame. After the deadliest war in history, the U.S. and Soviet Union both emerged exhausted. That conflict had forced them to fight as allies, since victory over the Nazis necessitated cooperation. As Churchill quipped, if Hitler had invaded hell, he would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. As it became clear that Soviet armies would remain in Eastern European countries they had liberated from the Nazis, American policymakers struggled to design a strategy for a post-war world in which its one-time ally was emerging as its greatest foe. The starting point for this strategy was a Manichean conviction about the Soviet Union. These statesmen saw it as an adversary as incompatible with democracy as Nazism or fascism, to quote America's first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal. In his historic long telegram from Moscow just 9 months after V-Day, George Kennan, then America's chargé d'affaires in Moscow, warned that expansionist Soviet communism was a political force committed fanatically to the belief that with the U.S. there could be no permanent modus vivendi. At its core, Kennan said, Soviet communists believed it was necessary that our society be disrupted, our traditional way of life destroyed, the international authority of our state be broken, if Soviet power is to be secure. Confronting such an adversary, America could survive only by destroying the USSR or transforming it. The rush of Soviet aggression in the immediate post-war period validated this analysis for American policymakers. a Soviet-sponsored coup in Czechoslovakia in 1948, the victory of Chinese communists in 1949, and Soviet-supported North Korea's invasion of South Korea in 1950 all presented the specter of communism on the march. In 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, denying the U.S. monopoly control of the absolute weapon. And although the Soviet economy was devastated during World War II, Russian society recovered much faster than it did following World War I. In the first decade after the Second World War, the Soviet economy more than doubled, increasing by half again in the next decade. Much of this new wealth was devoted to military spending. As Robert Gates, a senior U.S. intelligence official during the Cold War who would later serve as Secretary of Defense, notes, the USSR proceeded to undertake the largest military buildup in history over a 25-year period, with profound consequences for the international balance of power. As a result, in 1956 when Khrushchev famously claimed, "History is on our side, we will bury you," no one laughed. Before the nuclear age, such a threat would have required all-out war, a hot war as intense as the one the US, Britain, and their allies had just fought against Hitler's Germany. In that war, the goal could be nothing less than the enemy's unconditional surrender. But while the US arguably had an opportunity to attack and defeat the Soviet Union immediately after World War II and seriously considered the option, it declined to do so. After the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, American strategists began wrestling with the thought that in the contest with the Soviet Union, war, as they knew it, might soon be obsolete. In the greatest leap of strategic imagination in the history of American diplomacy, over a 4-year period from Kennan's long telegram and Secretary of State George Marshall's commencement speech at Harvard, in which he pointed to the Marshall Plan, to Paul Nitze's NSC-68, a top-secret memo outlining the military foundations for this competition, American leaders we now refer to as the wise men developed a comprehensive strategy for a form of combat never previously seen. Clausewitz taught us to understand war as the extension of international politics by other means. After foreign policy, diplomacy, and negotiation have done all they can to secure a nation's interest, armies, navies, and air forces can continue that effort with other instruments of influence. But what if direct engagement of armies risked national suicide? Under such conditions, alternatives had to be explored. Thus, they invented Cold War as the conduct of war by every means short of bombs and bullets used by the principal combatants directly against each other. The US and Soviet Union made systemic, sustained assaults against each other along every azimuth except one: direct military attacks. This included economic warfare, information warfare, covert actions, and even proxy wars in Korea, where Soviet pilots flew covert missions against US forces, Vietnam, where Soviet soldiers manned air defenses that shot down dozens of American aircraft, Angola, and Afghanistan, where CIA-backed Mujahideen covertly fought Soviet troops. In conducting this new form of war, both sides recognized that cold conflict could easily turn hot. To guard against that risk, they accepted, for the time being, many unacceptable facts on the ground. These included Soviet domination of the captive nations of Eastern Europe and the communist regimes in China, Cuba, and North Korea. In addition, the rivals wove an intricate web of mutual constraints around the competition, constraints that President John F. Kennedy called the precarious rules of the status quo. To reduce the risk of surprise nuclear attacks, for instance, they negotiated arms control treaties that provided greater transparency and instilled greater confidence in each party that the other was not about to launch a first strike. To avoid accidental collisions of aircraft or ships, they negotiated precise rules of the road for air and sea. Over time, both competitors tacitly agreed to each other's 3 no's: no use of nuclear weapons, no direct overt killing of each other's armed forces, and no military intervention in each other's recognized sphere of influence. For 21st century American students, perhaps the biggest surprise about the Cold War is the fact that the US actually had a coherent, bipartisan grand strategy that it sustained for 4 decades. Most people can remember containment. In reality, the US had a complex Cold War strategy that was built on 3 big ideas. The first identified the Soviet Union as an existential threat to America's core interests, literally a threat to the nation's existence. Under the flag of Marxist-Leninist ideology, Soviet forces threatened to engulf key countries in Europe and Asia, much as the forces of Islam had spread like wildfire in the 7th century. The Soviet Union was not only consolidating an outer empire of occupied countries in Eastern Europe, but also threatening a combination of internal subversion and external intimidation in US allied nations including Greece, France, and Italy. As NSC-68 stated, the Soviet Union, unlike previous aspirants to hegemony, is animated by a new fanatic faith antithetical to our own, and seeks to impose its absolute authority over the rest of the world. Absent a vigorous response, American strategists believed that societies demoralized by devastating war and exhausted economically could soon fall victim to communist expansion. The second pillar of U.S. Cold War strategy answered the fundamental question about the purpose of American foreign policy. As NSC 68 boldly put it in one line, the purpose was to preserve the U.S. as a free nation with our fundamental institutions and values intact. This mantra deserves a pause for reflection. In a world in which American leadership has been seen by many as a requirement for the U.S. to serve as a global police force responsible for defending those unable or unwilling to defend themselves, the Cold Warrior's unambiguous commitment to America first will strike many internationalists as anachronistic or even offensive. But these statesmen made no apology. The survival and success of the United States as a free nation was not only what Americans should and did care about most, it was the essential prerequisite for American power achieving any larger objective in the world. A third big idea built upon the second. It called for an unprecedented departure from America's historic aversion to entangling alliances. While the U.S. had the option of withdrawing to Fortress America, as it had done after World War I and in prior centuries, the Cold Warriors judged that this path was no longer viable in an increasingly interconnected world. America's survival and well-being required building nothing less than a new international order. But in contrast to the romanticism of post-World War I leaders like Woodrow Wilson, who imagined that they had concluded the war to end all wars, Cold War strategists recognized that surviving the Soviet threat would be a long-term project, very long-term. The foundation of this undertaking would be the economic and strategic centers of gravity, Europe and Japan. In a surge of initiative, these pragmatic visionaries created the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade to provide basic global economic order, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the U.S.-Japan Alliance to ensure that Europe and Japan were deeply integrated into the campaign against the Soviet Union and the United Nations, all as building blocks of a global order they sought to construct, floor by floor, over decades. This order aimed to defeat the Soviet adversary and thereby advance the cause of peace, prosperity, and freedom for Americans first, their allies second, and other nations thereafter. In confronting the Soviet Union, this strategy sought simultaneously to sustain three lines of effort: to contain Soviet expansion, to deter the Soviets from acting against vital American interests, and to undermine both the idea and the practice of communism. Containment prevented the USSR from acquiring additional capabilities. Even more importantly, it aimed to defeat the Marxist narrative of a historically inevitable advance. Soviet expansion could be stopped not by fighting Soviet troops, but rather by deterrence, credibly threatening to retaliate against Soviet aggression in ways that would impose unacceptable costs. Undermining the Soviet adversary began with the demonstration that US-led free market democracies trumped Soviet command-and-control economics and authoritarian politics in delivering what citizens wanted. But it also sought to magnify contradictions within Soviet strategy by intervening in nations' domestic affairs to encourage nationalism in Soviet satellites like Poland or allies like China, confident that national identities would prove more durable than dreams to create a new socialist man. Furthermore, the U.S. strategy advanced the values of freedom and human rights by persuading Soviet leaders to make written commitments to common ideals in the UN Declaration on Human Rights and the Helsinki Accords, confident that these were the rightful heritage of mankind. And to supplement these efforts, it sustained a campaign of overt and covert actions inside the Soviet Union and its satellites to undermine communist ideology and governments. Clue 6. There is nothing new under the sun except nuclear weapons. Some observers claim the 21st century is so different from the past that lessons from previous experience are no longer relevant. To be sure, it is difficult to find precedents for current levels of economic integration, globalization, and ubiquitous worldwide communication, or global threats from climate disruption to violent Islamic extremism. But as my colleagues Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff remind us in their analysis of 350 financial crises over the past 8 centuries, many previous generations have imagined that this time is different. Reinhardt and Rogoff side with Thucydides in reasoning that, as long as men are men, we can anticipate recurring patterns in human affairs. After all, one of the best-selling books in Europe in the decade before World War I was Norman Angel's The Great Illusion. It persuaded millions of readers, including many in high places like Viscount Esher, who was in charge of rebuilding the British Army after its poor showing in the Boer War that ended in 1902, that economic interdependence had made war an illusion, futile, because the warlike do not inherit the earth. Nonetheless, in one decisive respect, the late 20th and early 21st centuries are different from anything that preceded them. Nuclear weapons have no precedent. Einstein observed after the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that nuclear weapons have changed everything except our way of thinking. Yet over time the thinking of those who have shouldered responsibility for nuclear weapons has been changing. Statesmen know that today's arsenals include single nuclear bombs with more explosive power than all of the bombs that have been dropped in all the wars in history. They know that a full-scale nuclear Armageddon could actually extinguish life on Earth. Thus, nuclear weapons have what students of international relations call a crystal ball effect. Any leader contemplating a nuclear attack on a state with a nuclear arsenal capable of retaliation must confront the specter of killing tens or even hundreds of millions of his own people. Understandably and repeatedly, this has led them to think again. Clue 7. MAD really does make all-out war madness. After exploding its first bomb in 1949, the Soviet Union rapidly developed a nuclear arsenal, so substantial and sophisticated that it created what nuclear strategists recognized as mutual assured destruction, MAD. This described a condition in which neither the US nor the USSR could be sure of destroying its opponent's arsenal with a nuclear first strike before the enemy could launch a fatal nuclear response. Under such conditions, one state's decision to kill another is simultaneously a choice to commit national suicide. Technology, in effect, made the US and USSR and now Russia inseparable Siamese twins. While each still had a head and brain and will to act, their backbones have been fused to become one. In their united breast beats a single heart. On the day that heart stops beating, both unquestionably die. As awkward and uncomfortable as this metaphor is, it captures the defining fact about the US relationship with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and it remains the defining truth many 21st century Americans imagine somehow vanished when the Cold War ended. Both the US and Russia retain superpower nuclear arsenals. Thus, however evil, however demonic, however dangerous, however deserving to be strangled Russia is, the US must struggle to find some way to live with it or face dying together. In Ronald Reagan's oft-quoted one-liner, a nuclear war cannot be won and must therefore never be fought. Today, China has also developed a nuclear arsenal, so robust that it creates a 21st century version of MAD with the United States. The US recognizes this reality in its deployments of ballistic missile defenses, which exclude Russia and China from the threat matrix they are required to meet, since under current conditions, it is not feasible to mount a credible defense against them. Thus, in a second case, as Churchill noted about the Soviet Union, a sublime irony has made safety the sturdy child of terror and survival the twin brother of annihilation. Clue 8. Hot war between nuclear superpowers is thus no longer a justifiable option. The constraints imposed by MAD on the contest between the Soviet Union and the United States are relevant for American strategists thinking about China today. From the 1950s through the 1980s, the rise of the Soviet Union to superpower status created what came to be recognized as a bipolar world. Both nations believed that their survival required that they bury or convert the other. But if President Ronald Reagan was right, this had to be achieved without war. The central implication for U.S. strategy toward China from the U.S.-Soviet competition is therefore as uncomfortable to accept as it is impossible to deny. Once two states have invulnerable nuclear arsenals, hot war is no longer a justifiable option. Both nations must integrate this brute fact in their foreign policies. To repeat, we are inseparable Siamese twins. This means both must compromise in ways they would otherwise find intolerable and restrain themselves and their allies from taking actions that could escalate to all-out war. The Cold War seared this truth into the psyche and operations of the American national security community as it confronted the Soviet Union. But today, many policymakers dismiss this as ancient history. Nobody in the current generation of American leaders participated in that history. Few have experienced it vicariously. And while China has been slow in building a superpower nuclear arsenal and, unlike Putin's Russia in recent years, has never engaged in nuclear saber-rattling, some Chinese military officers still quote Mao's audacious claim that even after losing 300 million citizens in a nuclear exchange, China would still survive. It will take repeated, candid conversations between U.S. and Chinese political leaders as well as discussions among military officers enlivened by war games in which both parties threaten or even use nuclear weapons to help leaders on both sides internalize the unnatural truth that war is no longer an acceptable option. Helping leaders across both societies realize the implications of this big idea poses a still larger challenge. Clue 9. Leaders of nuclear superpowers must nonetheless be prepared to risk a war they cannot win. The nuclear paradox is inescapable. In a competition constrained by MAD, neither nation can win a nuclear war, but this is not the end of the matter. Paradoxically, each must demonstrate a willingness to risk losing such a war or find itself nudged off the road. Think again about the game of chicken discussed in Chapter 8. Consider each clause of the paradox. On the one hand, if war occurs, both nations lose. There is no value for which rational leaders could reasonably choose the deaths of hundreds of millions of their own citizens. In that sense, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev were partners in a struggle to prevent mutual disaster. But this is the condition for both nations, and the leaders of both nations know it. Thus, on the other hand, if either nation is unwilling to risk losing a nuclear war, its opponent can win any objective by creating conditions that force the more responsible power to choose between yielding and risking escalation to war. In order to preserve vital interests and values, therefore, leaders must be willing to choose paths that risk destruction. An analogous, but fortunately less deadly, dynamic can be seen in the economic and cyber competition between the U.S. and China. During the 2012 presidential campaign, Republican candidate Mitt Romney announced, "On day one of my presidency, I will designate China a currency manipulator and take appropriate counteraction." The political and economic establishment rejected his threat as reckless rhetoric that risked a catastrophic trade war. The establishment likewise rejected similar threats by President Donald Trump during the 2016 presidential campaign. But if there are no circumstances in which Washington is willing to risk a trade confrontation with China, why would Chinese leaders stop playing the U.S. like a fiddle and smiling all the way to the bank, to use Romney's mixed metaphor 65, or raping our country, as Trump put it 66, by undervaluing their currency, subsidizing domestic producers, protecting their own market, and stealing intellectual property? Just as the U.S. must be willing to risk economic warfare with China in order to incentivize constraints that preserve its economic interests, so too must Washington keep nuclear warfare in its toolkit in order to credibly deter real and potential adversaries such as China. From the collection of cases, 3 further lessons emerge. Clue 10. Thick economic interdependence raises the cost and thus lowers the likelihood of war. In the decades before World War I, the UK and German economies became so thickly interwoven that one party could not impose economic pain on the other without harming itself. Many hoped that this entangling web of trade and investments would prevent war. They were wrong. But when war did break out, the economic consequences for Berlin and London were extraordinary. Similarly, current U.S.-Chinese economic relations are so interdependent that they create an analog of MAD that has been labeled MEAD, Mutual Assured Economic Destruction. The United States is the largest market for Chinese exports, and China is America's largest creditor. If war prevented the U.S. from buying Chinese goods, and China from buying American dollars, the economic and social impact on each would almost certainly outweigh any benefits that war could achieve. Recognizing that Angel made a similar argument before World War I, proponents of MEAD have offered 2 further considerations. Some argue that Angel was right. The costs of war to all parties in World War I did far exceed the benefits the victors reaped. If given the chance to repeat their choices, none would. Since that is now clear, the next time statesmen will be smarter. Others emphasize differences between the earlier case and U.S.-Chinese economic relations today. Levels of trade and investment are similar to those prior to World War I. But supply chains connecting the indispensable producer to the irreplaceable consumer have become so integrated that virtually everything sold in the U.S., from iPhones to Boeing aircraft, is made with components from China. Furthermore, the Chinese government has made a cosmic bet on an open global marketplace to which it can sell its products, and on daily arrivals of tankers delivering oil to power its factories, cars, and planes. All are essential for sustaining the extraordinary rate of economic growth on which the Communist parties claim to political legitimacy. Indeed, its mandate of heaven depends. Both are vulnerable to interruption by the United States. America is not only the major market for Chinese products. 2/3 of China's oil imports travel across oceans where the U.S. Navy is the guardian and ultimate arbiter, a position it will retain long into the future. War between the U.S. and China, therefore, would certainly mean the end of both economies as we now know them. Even those who find meat in exaggeration would agree that thickening economic entanglement is creating within both societies influential actors who have big stakes in a productive relationship, which encourages them to become lobbies for peace. Clue 11. Alliances can be a fatal attraction. From Sparta's reaction to Athens, to Britain's response to Germany, the examples in the Thucydides Trap case file show how the dynamic of rise challenging rule can lead parties to seek allies as a counterbalance. Over the past decade, Chinese leaders have been surprised by the virulence of the responses to their surge of assertiveness. Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and even India have not only become more solicitous of the U.S., but also more cooperative with each other. Historically, such coalitions have sought to create a balance of power to maintain regional peace and security. But such alliances also create risks since alliance ties run in both directions. Nowhere is this more vividly displayed than in the decades leading to World War I. As described in Chapter 4, in attempting to prevent bloodshed, European statesmen constructed a doomsday machine that allowed an otherwise inconsequential assassination to trigger a general war. The historical record also instructs us that not all treaties are created equal. Defensive alliances are conditional, such as Athens's promise to come to Corcyra's defense if it were the victim of an unprovoked attack, or U.S. commitment to Taiwan, which is contingent on China being the aggressor. At the other end of the spectrum, the blank check the Kaiser gave the Austrian emperor emboldened his reckless risk-taking that triggered war in 1914. While the U.S. commitment in Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty is not equivalent to the Kaiser's guarantee to Austria, one can stump most American diplomats by asking them to explain why not. Given the fact that China's growing power is creating greater demand for U.S. protection in the region, Washington policymakers must carefully review what America's agreements with Asian allies truly entail. Clue 12. Domestic performance is decisive. What nations do inside their borders matters at least as much as what they do abroad. Three factors count most. Economic performance creates the substructure of national power. Competence in governance allows mobilization of resources for national purposes, and national elan or spirit sustains both. In time, nations with stronger economies, more competent governments, and unified national support have greater impact on the choices and actions of others. In Damon Runyon's cliché, while the race is not always to the swift or the battle to the strong, that is the way to bet. Britain saw the United States soar from an economy half its size in 1942 equality in the 1980s, on the way to becoming twice as large by 1914. As noted earlier, this drove realists in the Admiralty to a policy of accommodation. Had the U.S. economy faltered, the nation divided into two, or its government been corrupted or its politics paralyzed over differences like those that led to the Civil War, Britain's role in the Western Hemisphere could have been sustained well into the 20th century. Had the Soviet Union been able to sustain economic growth at twice the rate of the U.S. to become the leading economic power in the world, and communist ideology proved capable of overcoming nationalism in building the new socialist man, Moscow could have consolidated a position of hegemony not only in Europe, but also in Asia. Had its junior partner, Communist China, become the vanguard of communist expansion through wars of liberation, as most U.S. policymakers viewed the Vietnam War, a communist monolith could have overshadowed the U.S.-led free world. Had the crisis of capitalism that was seen as the principal cause of the Great Depression of the 1930s persisted in the decades after World War II, Western European states could have succumbed to the attraction of socialism's apparently inexorable march, on the one hand, and subversion by the KGB, on the other. Fortunately, these are just what-ifs. Instead, as Kennan foresaw, free markets and free societies proved more capable of delivering the economic, political, and personal benefits people wanted. Despite several decades of dramatic and frightening ascendancy, the Soviet Union failed because its core commitments to command and control economics and totalitarian politics could not compete. Armed with these dozen clues from the past, where do we go from here?